Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dateable, a show all about modern dating, where we dig into the whys of people's behavior as we look at society as a whole. And I say that with emphasis because of all the shit that went down in this past week. Julie, I'm just outraged by everything that's been going on in the news, and I still can't believe that we've come full circle back to the starting point of where all this happened at the beginning of COVID, where there was all that Asian discrimination with COVID being the Kung flu and all that bullshit. And look at us a year later. Not only do those stereotypes and hurtful words still exist, but they've now resulted in deaths and homicide. I think this is just, I'm at a loss for words at where we are in the US right now, because, you know, I came to the States when I was 8 years old, so I was not born here. And the year I left was the year of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And I was in Beijing when this happened. I was in school when we heard gunshots, and they took us out of school. And I remember being on the school bus and seeing people with bloodied faces on the street. And I remember going home to my mom, asking her what was happening. And she said, "Don't worry, we'll be in the US soon. It'll be safe for us." And I can't believe here we are, feeling extremely unsafe and oppressed by the racism that some people refuse to acknowledge in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I want to first start off and say, like, I'm sorry that you are going through this right now. And, like, all of our Asian listeners, like, I think it's incredibly difficult to, like, see people, you know, like, being treated this way. And I think it is the rhetoric from the start of COVID that has set the scene for this. And I think a lot of people are saying this shouldn't have been a surprise that this was going to happen. Like, one of our past guests, Mei Lee, who's the host of the Mei Lee show, is, you know, the Mei Lee show is basically all about, like, Asian Americans and lifting Asian Americans up. And she's been very vocal and did an incredible interview on a news channel and said, like, this should not be a surprise. This has been, like, you know, like, when you hear the president say this type of stuff, it does spawn outwards. And I think, like, you know, it's actually, unfortunately, too in theme with our episode this week with toxic masculinity. Unplanned. We actually edited it before all this happened, but it is 100% toxic masculinity. And I think, like, this whole, like, Asian rhetoric, like, I think sometimes, I mean, as a white person too, like, I remember I had male friends that would say, like, oh, I only like to date Asian women because they're, like, small and bendy and, you know, like, submissive and quiet. And at the time, like, I don't even think I realized, like, how damaging that narrative was. Like, I think, like, selfishly, I was like, oh, well, that doesn't describe me. That is, like, they're kind of, like, lucky in a way that they, like, have all these men, like, drooling over them. And then, like, all my Asian friends were like, no, it is not like that at all. Like, this is not something that, like, any of us want in any way. And I think it, like, you don't want men that, like, view you as weak. And I think that's exactly what this happened with, obviously, this whole thing. Like, I mean, like, they're saying, like, the motive is unclear, but come on, it's obviously race related. But even, like, the fact that a man would go in and kill, like, 8 Asian women, like, that means that, like, he viewed that as, like, an easy target, essentially.
Well, the fact that he went to separate places, it wasn't just one place, and he targeted only Asian massage parlors, that already is just so obvious. I don't know. You have to be a dumbass to not see that as race motivated. But I do also want to point out that these stereotypes, I think for years, Asians have been seen as the model minority. It is the most oppressive stereotype for us because whenever we do speak up, we are seen as the you know, the bad person. We're seen as bossy. We're seen as bitchy. We're seen as someone who stepped out of line and who's not a good Asian. And in fact, the Asian community also reprimands other Asians for speaking up. And if anything, this is our time to speak up, because if we don't do that now, we're just letting these stereotypes and the racism oppress us even more. And I know that in the last year, I've been speaking up more at work, and I do get looks and I do get comments and surprises. You know, why is she speaking up? She's supposed to be like the good worker, the hard worker. Well, fuck that. I have my own opinions, and I came to the U.S. because of this freedom of speech, because I can speak my mind. And so that I don't have to be part of this Tiananmen Square massacre that I was trying to escape from. And here I am feeling the exact same way by the country that I have every right to be in. So I feel for all of my Asian brothers and sisters right now. And I thank you for all the allies who've been vocal in supporting us. And we got to let everyone know this is just not fucking okay anymore.
Yeah, and I think it's like this compliment of being like, you know, feminine and submissive. Like, that is not a compliment. And I think, like, you know, years ago, and this is like all women, I mean, I think Asian women feel it even more. But I think this whole like patriarchy of like men feeling bigger with someone that's smaller, like, I think for so long we were fed like, you're supposed to be feminine, you're supposed to be like this. So that I think is why like I saw it like, oh, they're actually like seen higher than I am in this regard. But that like is not how it is whatsoever. No one wants to be seen as a less than, unequal, and no one wants to be like the target of someone because of that. Like, that's not a compliment in any way.
It is not our job to make you feel like you have a big penis. And if you, if you think that is what Asian women are put on earth to do, then you go to hell. It's fucking ridiculous, the comments that I've gotten, that my friends have gotten, from anything from like, oh, I love tight Asian pussies.
So gross.
Is it true that Asian women stay tight all their life? I've slapped 3 men in my life, all 3, because of comments like this. And I hope that I was not the only one that slapped them.
No, it is like a rhetoric too. Like, I mean, it's kind of, there's not really like a win-win on this, because I know like a lot of white friends of mine too, like it makes us feel bad because it's like, oh, you're not those things either. So it's not really like helping either party in this. It's just making all women feel like shit, basically.
I think we just have to recognize the oppression of our words. And when we say them, do we really mean them? Where does it come from? Where does this stem from? Take a step back before you say things that you've heard on TV or heard your friends joke around about, because those words can be extremely hurtful. And that's what our guest, Joseph, is going to talk about too, with toxic masculinity, with the words that you're brought up hearing around you, and not just like friends or the media, but even your family. Your parents have said certain things that now's the time to step back and ask, is this something that is okay to say? And most of the time it probably is not.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting, because I think when I think of toxic masculinity, I actually think of the guy that murdered everyone. Like, that is what comes to mind. And the fact that like the cop was like, oh, he had a bad day. Oh my God. It's like, come on. Like, there's so many other ways to handle a bad day other than killing a bunch of people. Let's like take that for what that is. But I think when I think of toxic masculinity, I think of like someone taking out rage and like, you know, treating women poorly. And there's definitely that side of it. But I think what Joseph brings, especially, which is also interesting because he's an Asian male, which I think Asian males also face this like kind of submissive vibe too. Like, there's actually stats that like Asian men are victims of hate crimes more than white men or even other men of color, just because they're more seen as weak. And I think like the fact that like he talks about just the whole like notion of like men, the way that he felt around toxic masculinity. It wasn't even necessarily toxic masculinity that men were doing to women, but how it can also impact another man's psyche.
The whole locker room talk, he talks about how uncomfortable it is to be in the crosswires of when people are talking about women in a certain way. And then they question his sexuality when he doesn't talk about women in a certain way. And he was questioned that by a woman, which I think is so crazy to think about too. So these are just some of the things we just got to step back and think about, like, why are we talking like this? Where did this language come from? It makes absolutely no sense. And Trevor Noah made a really good point in his rant. His Instagram rant is phenomenal if you haven't seen it or heard it. He says, why is it that in the Atlanta shootings, the media was trying to humanize the shooter by saying he was at the end of his rope, he had a really bad day, he had a sex addiction, when what about the 8 people whose lives are now gone, whose families have to deal with the hurt and the pain of losing their family members? What about those people? Did they deserve to be at the end of someone's rope and the consequences of someone having a bad day? Shieldy posted something that was like, I had what was that quote she found? Yeah,
it's like, I ate cheesecake for dinner if I had a bad day.
And I had 6 chicken thighs. Like, I did not murder 8 people.
No, it's true though, but I think the other side, I'm not, in any way, saying what he, giving any reason against this guy, but I think it is a sign of toxic masculinity, because we talk about with Joseph that the side effects is this aggression that comes out, or suicide, or things that really can be detrimental to a person because of all this bottled up emotion. And again, I'm not making excuses for this guy at all, but I'm sure that's where it came from. The fact that he didn't have outlets to get this out, or whatever it might be. Again, I'm not trying to make excuses, but I think this stuff does show up, and it's problematic for society, because then it ends up being, someone that's just in there doing their job gets reprimanded, essentially.
But I'm glad you brought this up, Julie, because remember in our Connor Beaton episode, he talks about being at the end of your rope and being at feeling like you've hit rock bottom, and that's when you feel like you need a change. And we talked about how a lot of men feel like they have to hit that rock bottom before they change out of toxic masculine behavior. But that episode was so fantastic, because we talk about how you don't need to hit the rock bottom. We actually have to catch the toxic masculinity before it gets there, because that's when it gets dangerous for the people, for the person himself, and for society.
Totally. I think the other thing that was super interesting as well is that, relating it actually back to last week's episode about age, there were a couple things that I thought was super interesting. There was one comment in our Facebook group that, Victoria, one of our community members, made a comment that she likes to date down because, in a way, it actually levels the playing field between men and women, because by default, men are higher on the due to patriarchy and all the stuff that we're living in a man's world. So I thought that was a super interesting comment, in the sense that this is existing in every aspect of our lives with toxic masculinity, whether it's a direct thing or an indirect thing.
So these are some of the topics that we actually discuss in the sounding board with other open mind, open heart people who are willing to have these open discussions about them. And that's why we love this community so much. And we don't just talk about deep topics like this. I mean, obviously this is a very heavy topic. We also talk about other things like ghosting and breadcrumbing and any other new dating term that's out there. And we keep it light and fun as well. So if you're looking for that community, especially during this time, and you're craving that support, the community that we've created at the Sounding Board is, I think, one of the best communities out there for anybody who's seeking that. And I just want to make a plug for what we've created there. Just go to dateablepodcast.com/sounding board for all the information. We had a wonderful event with Ken Page on deeper dating, but also finding your core gifts. Julie, were you what are my core gifts before this? What does that even mean?
Yeah, I think like you might be able to tell from my voice, I'm a little raspy and under the weather right this minute. I've actually had a head cold that I didn't think was possible during this time. I do not have COVID. I'm pretty damn sure about that because I don't have any of the symptoms for COVID. But I think like I was a little delirious on meds, and I'm like trying to put everything together. And I think what I realized with this whole core gifts thing, because we really tied it back to like dating trauma. I think like regardless, we all have trauma. I mean, including some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, like that's traumatic. And what I've learned though is that the things that sting us the deepest are actually our core gifts. So what I was kind of trying to like put it together was Ken was basically saying like, you know, like if ghosting really bothers you, like that is like so traumatic that you're like fear ghosting happening. Like if you look at the flip side of ghosting, why it bothers you is that someone was not able to close the loop in a way that felt respectful, even though it was like a difficult conversation. And the way I look at that is like actually your core gift is that you really value that. And that's something that you're able to do. And that's why it tends to dig really deep for you. And I think like what I've learned from all of this conversation is, yes, we can feel what we need to feel with all the trauma that happens in dating. But at the end of the day, like just sitting in hurt isn't moving us forward. So while we could feel it, like just getting bitter and more bitter, like what is that? How is that helping us? So I love this like rechanneling it into like, okay, you know, like I can't deal with these people that are flaky. Well, that means that I'm pretty damn like reliable and that I stick with my guns and my plans. Like that makes me a great partner. Like I'd rather us reframe things that way.
Yeah, I had a light bulb moment with that because I think about how for earlier on in dating, a lot of people like to say things that they don't like. People say, I really do not like it when people ghost. I really do not like it when people don't text back. What if we flip the script and instead of listing out all the things you don't like in dating, you flip it to all the things that you do admire and that you do well. So I am very accountable and I respond back to texts in a timely manner and I never ghost. If you turn it back on you, it gives more accountability for the person that you're dating because now they're thinking, okay, if she values these qualities, then I must uphold my standards to the same level.
And it's also, instead of looking at it like, oh, this person ghosted me, there's something wrong with me, it's, okay, this person can't communicate effectively. Right. Do I want that? You know, I think there's that shift. That's a subtle shift. And yeah, you could argue like, maybe it doesn't change your dating life outcome. In that moment, that person still ghosted you. But I strongly believe it actually does change your outcome because you show up to the next date positive instead of this state of like, poor me. Like, who wants to date that? No one. But we have more important things to talk about. Let's talk about toxic masculinity.
Here's Joseph.